probably start in the next minute or so. All right, everybody, I think it's a good time to get started now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Ricardo Lowe. You can call me Ricky Lowe, and I am a research associate here at IUPRA, which is the Institute of Urban Policy, Research and Analysis. I'm also an applied demography PhD student at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So once again, thank you for joining us for today's event. Today's event is called I Cannot Breathe, Approaches to Addressing Police Brutality in the Black Community. And 2020 has been a really intense year, and we know about COVID-19. And of course, the highlight being police brutality with the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And given the increased tensions over how communities experience criminal justice and questions about the role of police enforcement abound, we wanted to create this panel today so that we can consider the role of policing in the Black community and its implications for racial justice. So a couple of things before we get started. This event is hosted by the Opportunity Forum and IUPRA. And again, IUPRA stands for the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. So here at IUPRA, we are an interdisciplinary policy research institute that provides intersectional policy solutions. Our mission is to strengthen Black communities, promote social justice, and to combat anti-Black racism using a racial equity framework. IUPRA was developed through the collaborative efforts of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus and Black Studies at UT Austin. Together, Black Studies form a unique approach to university education, research, and cultural programming within the College of Liberal Arts. So before I introduce our moderator, we also wanted to thank our student organization co-sponsors who helped spread the word about today's event. The Thurgood Martial Law Society, the Chicano Hispanic Law Student Association, and American Constitution Society, or ACS. So a big thank you for all your endeavors today. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our moderator, Dr. Gordon Abner. He's an assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His primary research interests are in the areas of employee morale, organizational performance, governance structures, and policy implementation in the public sector. So he's currently working on research that examines governance structures in policing. So Dr. Gordon, thank you for moderating today. I will be on, I'm just going to close my screen so that I won't disrupt the conversation. And I'll let you go ahead and take the platform, Dr. Abner. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ricky, and thanks to IUPRA for hosting this event. First, I would like to introduce Kami Chavis, a former assistant United States attorney for the District of Columbia and current professor of law and the director of the Criminal Justice Program at Wake Forest University School of Law. Professor Chavis is also currently a visiting professor at the University of Texas School of Law, where she is teaching a course on police and prosecutorial accountability. So welcome, Kami. Next, we have Chris Harris. He is a native Texan and passionate advocate working to transform the criminal legal system. He currently serves as the director of criminal justice programs for Texas Appleseed, a public interest nonprofit that promotes social and economic justice for all Texans, and as a public safety commissioner representing District 1 in the city of Austin. Welcome, Chris. Next, we have Fatima Mann. She's a birther and the director of the Community Advocacy and Healing Project, a 501c3 dedicated to cultivating culturally mindful, healing, and human-centered experiences and policy reform. Fatima is a trailblazer in these areas and has curated culturally mindful, healing, and human-centered experiences all throughout the country. Welcome, Fatima. Next, we have Farah Muscadin. She is the director of the Office of Police Oversight, a newly established entity in the city of Austin. Previously, she serves as the Police Monitor, Office of the Police Monitor for the city of Austin. Farah holds a Bachelor's of Business Administration from the University of Iowa and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Iowa College of Law. So thank you, Farah, excuse me, for joining us. So I'm going to kick it off now, and to give context around today's topic, would anyone like to speak to the data or statistics that demonstrate the magnitude of police brutality among Black communities? Kami?
Hi, it's Cami Chavis.
Cami, sorry, I'm so sorry.
No problem. Cami Chavis, and so first of all, thank you for having this forum and for this opportunity to speak and interact with everyone. When I think about police violence and the Black community, it's interesting because when we think about uses of force, right? This is anytime an officer is putting their hands, it can just be putting your hands on someone. And we used to talk about going through a continuum, a use of force continuum. Maybe it's putting your hands, then pushing someone into the wall, even putting handcuffs on someone is considered a use of force, and all the way up through drawing your weapon, your service weapon, and then using it. And of course, there are lots of different tools that officers have at their disposal, batons, pepper spray, all of that. At each space in the continuum, Blacks are, force is used disproportionately against Blacks. And we haven't even talked about deadly force. Before we even think about deadly force, Black and Hispanic people are 50% more likely than whites to have an interaction with police that involves a use of force. And they're 21, Black and Hispanics, 21% more likely to be involved in a police interaction where a weapon is drawn. So we haven't even talked about deadly force. So when that force becomes deadly, we also see Black Americans disproportionately represented, even though 38% of people, and I want to get this right. So I am going to refer to my statistic here, but there's a 2016 study from the Guardian that talks about how even more white people in total are killed by the police. When you correct for the percentage of the population, while people of color make up fewer than 38% of the US population, they make up 63% of unarmed people killed by police. So there's just, we can get it out of the way, there's no doubt about it, that use of force and deadly use of force is used more against Black people in this country.
Awesome.
I'd like to add to that a little bit too, and thank you for that, Cami, and thank you all for this forum and the opportunity to participate. Northwestern University put out research last year looking just at homicides by police officers, and what they found is that Black men and women, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native men and women, are significantly more likely to be killed by police than white men and women. In particular, Black men, about 1 in 1,000 in the United States, can be expected to be killed by the police. Black men are about 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by the police. So it is a significant issue in our country, and it has both gender, age, and racial components to it, but it impacts Black men and women more than anyone else.
And greetings, everyone that just logged on. Thank you for being here. I hope you all are drinking water and taking care of yourselves. Also, the numbers tend to not reflect student resource officers, so the engagements of policing in schools. And as we start looking at those numbers, we can see that Black and brown children are more likely to be in contact with student resource officers, which leading to that school to prison pipeline. So sometimes when we think about policing, we forget that there's police in our schools too. And those numbers are just as disproportionate as the ones that are being talked about here, and really wanting to be honest about where are the school resource officers and what schools are they in, and how has that been exasperated throughout time, and making sure that Black and brown children are literally going to school and then being arrested and detained are numbers that I don't think that we get access to as much. School districts don't always give us the information on how many children that they may send to suspension, but not how many children they send from suspension to alternative schools and then to juvenile detention halls. And so just wanted to be cognitive of those numbers being high and disproportionate for Black and brown children as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, hello everybody, Farah Muscadin, Office of Police Oversight, City of Austin. Just some local data, and I encourage everyone to read our racial profiling report that we issued January of this year. And I think it's really important to look at traffic stops, because traffic stops lead to, and fundamentally in all of the previous speakers, they all talked about the point of disproportionality. And that's what we really need to focus on in this conversation, because when we look at specifically the city of Austin, as a Black person, you are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested, period, based on APD data. And so when we look at the fact that as African Americans, we are 8% of the population, where 15% of the stops and 25% of the arrests, that indicates a serious problem. And so I think that we need to continue to, because I hear this narrative about, well, no, when you look at the numbers, more white people are stopped. And I get that, because there are more white people in Austin, clearly, right? But when you look at the direct impact on African Americans in terms of our very small 8%, we are very much disproportionately impacted. And I think we need to continue to explain that and understand how the impact of police interactions are much more negative for African Americans than anybody else in the city. And so I just want the audience to see that thread that has been sewn through all the previous speakers, because we're fundamentally talking about how population relates to impact, and really the key word is disproportionality.
Thank you, that's great. So I'm gonna direct this question to Chris initially, but everyone, please feel free to answer it. When people discuss police brutality, it's often not separate from the larger issue of state violence that brings harm to communities. Can you explain the concept of state violence in America and its connection to policing across the nation?
Sure. Yeah, so state violence is any use of force, coercion, incarceration, surveillance, oppression, intentional deprivation enacted by an agent or organ of the state in a way that it's legally permissive and perceived as legitimate in order to pursue some defined goal of the state or a government entity. Policing are the primary, but by no means sole, kind of instrument of state violence in the US. At least as it's enacted upon US citizens. Obviously, the US military enacts state violence abroad. Obviously, I think it's made plain by the fact that almost none of the police's actions are perceived as illegitimate by the state, such as they result in criminal prosecution and some sort of action by the state to curtail it.
Thank you. So sort of moving to the next question here, when police discuss police brutality, they often reference a variety of solutions for addressing the problem. When people discuss police brutality. So using language such as abolishing, defunding, or reforming police departments. And there are different opinions concerning the benefits and challenges of each of these approaches. So can some of you speak to the sort of benefits and drawbacks of these various approaches in terms of abolishing, defunding, reforming police departments, or other sort of popular terms that are being thrown about today?
Well, if I and I want to link this to your previous question that Chris answered when we think about state violence. So, for example, in my courses, I teach about, the police department is really kind of a modern institution, right? That grew out of, for example, some of the earliest law enforcement agencies really were bands of citizens who were protecting their property, which were slaves. So they grew out of slave patrols. And then as we move and we think about police departments and or law enforcement and the complicity during Reconstruction and the time immediately thereafter with the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings, and being law enforcement being not sometimes present there, sometimes participating there, and then at the very least turning a blind eye to those who committed those types of atrocities. And then we can move even more recently, and we can think about the civil rights movement. And I think about, and we've seen a lot lately, this iconic picture of Congressman, the late Congressman John Lewis, who was being beaten by police officers on Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so we can't really divorce law enforcement from violence against Black people and Black bodies. And then when I even think about the war on drugs in the 1980s and how that was perpetrated or how that war was fought in Black communities, it looks very different than another very serious crisis, the opioid crisis, which is handled totally differently. So when we think about that and the historical linkage of state violence, that is why I think we hear so much about defunding and abolishing the police when people talk about that. I will personally say that I don't agree with abolishing the police. I don't agree with defunding in terms of taking money away. I do agree with it. I'm a former prosecutor, so I've seen a lot of violence perpetrated against Black people that I would also want anyone who perpetrated that violence to be held accountable for. And so I believe that there's a proper role for police officers, but I think we need to rethink, we need to reallocate funds, and I think that we need to make sure that those who have those funds are accountable and that they are using them in equitable ways. So I think if you are engaging in biased and aggressive policing, that we need to look at that and we need to reallocate. So sorry to take up that time, but I wanted to connect it to we're hearing these calls for abolishing and defunding because of the ways in which law enforcement has been used in our country against Black people.
So thank you, Cami, for the historical context. I think that's important. I think we forget how how policing became policing. And then that the fact that our country was started by racist white men, and people don't want to talk about that either, right? We don't want to talk about, our country being founded by white men for white men in a way that says that white men owned property. Those properties were Black bodies and they had to be able to protect those Black bodies. And now these same Black bodies that used to be slaves are now new slaves in this whole era of this new Jim Crow, right? And having this mass incarceration and what happens around capitalism and who gets paid every time someone's arrested and who benefits every time someone gets incarcerated is usually some big company that gets to benefit from the fact that, there's people that they built these little cells for, and now their entire lives they're now new slaves, right? So in terms of defunding and abolishing policing, I think I'm a word person. I don't like those words. I honestly think that we need to just figure out a whole new system and call it something else. And we need to be willing to describe and really define what that system is going to look like and how is that system going to portray and allow people to heal and get access to what they need. Because if we look at why people are being incarcerated or how people are even getting in contact with police, there's this whole disconnect of the system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And then now Black and brown people are put on this conveyor belt that connects them to the system in which we now know as policing and then mass incarceration. So I personally believe we should be considering what happens when you decide to take humans' jobs away, right? And these are human beings with guns. These are human beings with guns that some of them are racist and don't mind, right? If they lose their job, going out and doing and creating their own militias. So my thing is, what is the impact of what we're trying to do? Because it sounds good to defund and abolish. Those are great emotional words, but if we're talking about what the actual impact will be and who will be impacted the most in a negative way, disproportionately, it will always be, and I can say always, it will always be people of the African diaspora. It will be Black and brown bodies always, whether it's through ICE, whether it's through, stop and frisk, whether it's through people lost their jobs and now my family is everybody's armed and willing to go into Black and brown neighborhoods because Black and brown people were the ones advocating to abolish and take away these jobs. So for me, I think it's really what is our intent and then what is our impact, and in saying we don't have to utilize certain terminology to get the impact we seek, and we don't have to call it policing, and we don't have to have what we know as police officers. We keep trying to recreate, use the same word and redefine it instead of just creating something completely new and then seeing how do we like move from this old into the new, and it's a beautiful thing to focus on. And I think these words of defunding and abolishing, they don't hold as much weight as I think that we should in terms of impact. And I'm thinking about the people who are going to be impacted the worst, and that's always us.
Well, I agree that we need something totally new. I will do a little bit of counterpoint as someone who's advocated for defunding and divesting best strategies as it relates to police. Obviously, firstly, as far as the definition, I mean, I think it's taking resources away from the entities that are authorized to use state violence today, and investing them in alternative approaches that are both designed to address the issues that those entities are assigned the task of responding to today, as well as investing in social services and other support systems that are designed to ultimately prevent the perceived need for those entities that are authorized to use state violence. So I think concretely, that's what defunding is. Now, I think the confusion that many have with the terms, some of it is willful. People are not confused when you say defund Planned Parenthood or defund public schools. They get that just fine. There is a difference, though, in terms of supporters, and that some supporters of defund see it as a goal in of itself, shrink the police department down to maybe some core things while pushing off things that they're specifically not really well trained to do to other systems and fund those instead, as well as do things like try to alleviate or even eliminate poverty. Whereas for others, defund is part of a long-term strategy for abolition to actually ultimately defund police all the way to nothing. And I think, that ultimately abolition is designed to force us to envision a world where there is no one authorized to use state violence, where the use of force, threats, coercion, violence of any form is not perceived as legitimate by any by any of us, and there's no way to get there. And so I think that whether or not you support abolition, I do think that that goal And keeping that in mind is of extreme value. This has a long history of scholarship, this notion of abolition, and I think it's a really powerful and strong idea that even if that's not the ultimate goal that folks in the work have, the strategies that they employ specifically designed to reduce the power, the funding, and the tools available to these entities to enact state violence on people should be reduced. And it's exactly to the point that Fatima said, which is that whenever there is an entity that is empowered to use violence, and that violence is perceived as legitimate in our country, who will it be used against? It will always be used against the poor, people of color. And that's what we see now, right? That's how policing works today. That's how prosecution works today. That's how the courts work today, and prisons work. So, I think, Fatima raises a great point, which is obviously like that violence more broadly, even that not enacted by the state, is a really big concern and something that we 100% need alternative approaches to address, and that violence also disproportionately impacts communities of color and the poor. And so we can't walk into anything lightly. We have to ensure that we have in our enacting strategies to address that. But it also is a recognition that authorized state violence also doesn't work to our benefit. And how can we work to reduce and eliminate it ultimately?
Yeah, I just want to add just briefly, I'm coming in this conversation through the lens of what I do, which is police oversight. And so I don't really tend to, the terminology for me from that lens is not as important as what the goal is. And fundamentally what I'm seeing is, what do we want the scope of police to be, right? And clearly we have enough information and historical context to know that the current framework of policing does not meet the needs of serving and protecting communities of color, period. So how can we transform that? Furthermore, which I tend to get in a back and forth with a lot of law enforcement and APD on this, is that I think a lot of times they are outside their lane. And we as a community need to define their lane. Because I don't want the police officer to be my therapist, my coach, my pep talk when I need one, my doctor. I don't want none of that. I want you to fundamentally keep me safe, right? And so I think that in the way of defunding, reallocating, abolishing, I don't know what y'all want to call it, but what I want to call it is a system that fundamentally does what the community wants it to do and defined by the community by what it means by serving and protecting. Because right now I can tell you in the city of Austin, particularly in communities of color, they don't feel served and they don't feel protected. And the tension is palpable, like you can feel it. And so that to me is at cross purposes of what the community needs. And so, and my last statement on this, law enforcement is not the answer to all our social issues, and it shouldn't be. And we have got to remove that expectation. And so I think that I actually agree, even though they're different perspectives, but I agree with everybody in terms of what they said. But fundamentally, I mean, can we create a system that has me looking for another job? How about that, right? A system where we don't need police oversight, because right now we really need it. You know what I mean? And so I think that's where I feel like I take a little piece of Cami, I take a little piece of Fatima, I take a little piece of Chris to really say, community, let's define what we mean by serve and protect and create that.
I want to echo what Farah said in terms of community has to lead, and that has not been happening. And we've been saying, and there's not a single police chief in this country that will tell you, if you say, oh, what model of policing do you? Oh, we do community policing. They all will say that. Oh yeah, we believe in community policing, and we know that's different. With real community policing is when you have the community setting their own priorities. And like what I mentioned earlier about the war on drugs and the opioid crisis, and this is how these things are portrayed: the war on drugs, the opioid crisis, right? The different communities there, the communities that are highly impacted by the opioid crisis have set those priorities, and they have said, oh, this is a public health issue, and we're going to deal with it in a public health way, and law enforcement is not appropriate here. And so I say, well, why isn't that the case then for all of these other things? And when we think about the transformation that needs to happen, why is it that we need an armed first responder to respond to anyone who's having and I'm thinking about the different cases that we're seeing, to anyone who is naked and having a mental health crisis? You don't need an armed first responder to respond in that situation. And that is just one piece of the types of changes that we need to have.
Thank you. I think that's a great segue. There was a question from the audience that I want to tie to that previous response from Cami, and it's, are there other professions that could be involved in this space to help prevent negative encounters, to produce better outcomes for our citizens and for people in our community? And so if so, what are some of those professions, and what sorts of responsibilities would you give to them to sort of take away from all the responsibilities that police are now being confronted with?
So I would like to first say that whatever professionals come in, they need to be culturally mindful, right? They need to have some knowledge and information about the various backgrounds of different communities and different people. And I'm a history lover, and there's this book called Stamped from the Beginning, and he does a beautiful job of explaining how most systems have started from racist ideology. So even if we start bringing in mental health professionals or social workers or psychologists and all these other people, are we getting people who are very much so aware of the cultural norms of Black and Brown people? And I think that that's important too, because people can say, oh, well, we have social workers and we have, clinicians and we have all these other people. But once again, if you look at, certain types of diagnoses that people have that are incarcerated, Black and Brown people tend to have the ones that put you in prison first, like in terms of diagnoses, right? If you look at how people are diagnosed. So to me, it's not just the type of profession, but it's the knowledge and privy that they have to our cultural norms and racialized trauma and how race plays a role in trauma. So to me, the answer to the question is people who have, behavioral science backgrounds, I think are really good professionals. And people who have some information about like customer service. People don't know how to talk to people. There's a whole lot of people who do not know how to have conversations. Lawyers being one of them, doctors being one of them. You could, in law school, we don't have a class on how to communicate with the people that you talk to. Doctors don't either. So to me, it's if we're going to transform this system, if we're going to think of different ways, then we also need to be thinking about how people are trained. In whatever profession that we as a community come up with. But it just can't be, well, we want, social workers and mental health professionals, but I don't want all mental health professionals. I don't want all social workers in my community, because we've had social workers in our communities. We have mental health workers in our communities, and our communities are still looking the same way they look. So I wanna be honest and real about having a label or a professional doesn't mean that our communities are still going to get the help that they need if that person isn't to me from the impacted community, or at least has some tie to the impacted community. A person who is tied to the impacted community tends to know how to address a community better, knows about cultural normalcies than other communities do. And even no matter what their degrees are or non-degrees are, tend to be able to align with the communities a lot better. So to me, it's having people from impacted communities that are connected and have ties are just as important as whatever label or profession that we decide as a people should be replacing and or helping law enforcement.
I agree 100% with Fatima, because she's fundamentally talking about cultural competency and lived experience and how that helps make a connection to the communities that we serve. But I want to move away from and dispel that public safety equals law enforcement. Public safety equals whatever we define it at. Public safety equals teachers, professors, you know what I mean? It is the crossing guard, right? It is what we've seen, lights in the community, right? So we really have to get away from thinking that law enforcement is equivalent to public safety. Public safety is so much broader in terms of really delivering to the community what they want. And what is that? To feel safe and welcomed in their own community. And so I think we need to take that burden or take that title or whatever it is off of law enforcement, because it is much broader in terms of what we're looking for. And so I would say, and I think your initial question was what other entities could be a part of this. I say everybody that has what Fatima was talking about, the people that have the lived experience and the cultural competency, and really the sincerity of really service and what that means to better communities. And so that's just kind of my 2 cents of what I would add to that question.
Yeah, I echo what's been said already, and I would emphasize the community portion of it. I think that a lot of the movements behind recent police reform and other efforts are very much concentrated on more community-based programming, institutions that, to the extent possible, already have pre-existing relationships with folks in those communities, and or are invested in building them, such that people actually feel tied to the outcomes and tied to each other and how we interrelate. And so yes, it has to be all of us. It's not, there's no single profession that's a silver bullet. Clearly, we have a big hole where there's a lot of mental health calls being responded to by police, and in Austin in particular, we have the highest per capita police killings of people on mental health crisis calls in the country. And so we do need people that are able to respond to those situations. But mostly we just need people that are invested in the outcomes of others, and ultimately should not be empowered to exert violence or incarcerate them at the end of that encounter, wherever possible.
So thank you all. So moving to the next question here. So various forms of police reform have already been implemented across the nation with different levels of impact. One example of this is use of police body cameras. And so which reforms, not just about police body cameras, but reforms more broadly, have you seen that have been the most effective and have the most buy-in from stakeholders? And I'm going to direct this to Kami. And am I saying that right this time? No, okay.
It's okay.
Kami, all right, goodness, great. I write it down, but I'm still misreading what I'm writing down. All right, thank you.
Yes, it's Kami Chavis. Everything in North Carolina is a long A. Kami
Okay.
Chavis. So we, I've done a lot on law enforcement and technology, and body cameras being part of that technology. And so one thing that that I will say is, or that concerns me, right? So you'd think that, all right, if we can, technology, we ought to be able to use technology to improve public safety, right? Farah's definition of public safety. And anybody who, law enforcement officers ought to be able to use those tools like anybody else would. Technology could improve their job. Technology is great because I can surveil a car or a suspect without coming into contact with them. And this might lead to less violent interactions, or less interactions that could become violent. But I become very concerned about that, because also with Black communities, we are already over surveilled. And when you don't have the community setting priorities, leading, and these policies, body camera policies, shot spotter, gun detection software, types of things, drones, predictive policing. There are a lot of different ways that technology is being used in law enforcement now, and the community often has no say. And sometimes if you look at the drone program in Baltimore, the community had no knowledge that this was being used, that drones were being used to surveil activities. And there was a private partnership with the police department. And that's very troubling. So while I think that technology can be helpful, I think we need to be mindful of the concerns, the other concerns that come along with them. And particularly with body cameras, we think about privacy concerns, and that is something that we should still be concerned about, our privacy. But at the same time, when I think about weighing some of these options, if we take body cameras, unfortunately, without body cameras, a lot of times we would not have the images that really have led to some of the social movements that have then led to some of the policy movements that we've been able to see. So it's a really delicate balance, though. And I will say that there's no one thing that is going to solve this problem for us. We have got to use everything at our disposal. And there are a lot of different things we can talk about later about solutions, but technology can play a role, but it has to be done very carefully and with the knowledge and understanding that our communities are vulnerable, and we still need to be setting those priorities and need to be consulted before they're implemented.
Yeah, I'll just say that I share a lot of those concerns with body cameras. I think, and as far as like what reforms work, I think, there is some statistical analysis that supports, some specific policy changes, use of force, restrictions, as well as implementing things like continuums, and prioritizing de-escalation, loss of life, ensuring that officers intervene in certain situations. That show some promise of reductions in certain places. The issue ultimately is that we haven't seen that bear out over long periods and over the country, right? Pretty much every year we see about 1,000 people killed by the police, and it doesn't seem to change. And so, I think I'm really looking forward to really what the outcomes are of cities that have undertaken a process of starting to actually meaningfully reduce the role of police, take them out of certain functions and replace them with folks, again, who aren't authorized to use violence or incarcerate. What they're doing in Berkeley to put in place civilians that are going to be doing traffic enforcement. When we looked at the numbers in Austin, police spend an inordinate amount of their time either doing traffic enforcement or actually just traffic management in response to traffic crashes, right? Many of them minor. So we've got police, directing traffic, filling out insurance reports, stuff like that. And each one of these things doesn't need to be someone armed or anything like that. But each one of these encounters represents a risk, particularly if the people on the other end of them are poor or people of color. So I think we're starting to see some exciting reforms that I think hold a lot of promise, and I think it'll be an interesting time to see how those bear out.
I think technology is good, but policy isn't catching up with technology, right? So when the body wearing cameras rolled out in Texas, I think it was in a Texas legislature in 2015 when they passed it. And then Austin Police Department, they started writing their policy around what policy they would use as an organization and department, like right after that. But there wasn't, I feel like there was maybe a couple of community members at the table who had was involved in that process. And it was my first year out of law school. I was going into my 2L year, and I realized how amazing policy was and words, right? And how the difference between should and will not, and the verbiage around it. So when we start talking about technology, we also need to realize that there's not community-based policy involved in writing how that technology will utilize, or especially if you're in big tech cities where different cities are coming to police trying to get them to get contracts. I know that the city of Austin and a lot of the organizers there, we did a lot of work of trying to stop contracts around the technology because the technology didn't have policies that protected the people. So when you have all of these new technology coming out and there isn't like legislators aren't picking up, they're not catching up as quick as technology is coming out. So what usually happens is we think it could be a really good thing, like face recognition. But then you look at who would be impacted negatively. Then everybody's like, oh no, we don't want face recognition anymore. Or when the license plates readers, and you could pick up somebody's entire life just by scanning their license plates. Most communities aren't informed about what's being rolled out from a technology, like from just a technology world. And then from a policy perspective, there's not enough of us in the room talking about, okay, so you're rolling out this technology. So how would that be utilized? What are the things that one can do with it? What can't they do with it? And if our state legislators, because in Texas, they meet every 2 years, but even just around the world, around the country, if your legislators aren't privy to protection of people and privacy laws, then when a tech company decides to go to your local police department to sell them this really cool new toy, then all of a sudden your police department has a cool new toy that costs millions of dollars that could have went to somewhere else, and on top of that is going to infringe upon your rights that it may not be your constitutional rights infringe upon, because once again policy hasn't caught up to your constitutional rights being infringed upon utilizing the technology that's coming out. So when we talk about utilizing it, I'm like, yes, and who's at the table? Why are these big businesses, always coming out to try to sell to police? And why aren't community members being informed about the type of technology that these big businesses are selling to police? And police departments having such a huge budget to be able to get this technology that once again infringe upon rights that haven't been defined as being infringed upon yet, because there hasn't been any policies to latch them. So I think that those two tend, like, since a body-worn camera policy has come out, it has shown me that it's great. It can be great, but then also it can be detrimental, because if no one is, like, if you don't have a Farah, right? If you don't have a police of oversight to look at these videos, then what's the good of having a video? Like, what's the point if you don't have people who can look at them and make sure that your encounter is just? And a lot of cities don't have that too. So it's like you just have this technology and you have all this information, but then what? There's no then what with it. And I think that the only then what tends to benefit the state and not the people, and that's the problem.
I just want to tag on really quickly what Fatima was saying, in that I could just tell you from my work, body-worn camera is not a deterrent at all whatsoever. It should be viewed as a tool to see images only. It should not be seen as a deterrent, because it clearly is not. And I agree with Fatima's point about my office is tasked with the review and maintenance of the APD administrative policies, right? So we have to make sure that APD officers are following APD's own policies. And when we look at the policies, I mean, they're written in a way that provides a little bit too many gaps for me. And the body cam one is a very great example of that. And our office has filed an objection with the police department because they lowered the discipline requirements for officers who violate body cam. And I was just appalled by it, because it sends the wrong message, right? You can't say you're for transparency and then you lower the discipline requirements for when an officer violates a body cam policy. Now, we're not talking about when officers out to dinner or going to the bathroom. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about. Oversight, we're not worried about that. We're worried about interactions with people, right? And so we have to set that standard. And so I am very much looking into, because I think APD's body worn camera is about 3 years old, maybe a little bit older. reevaluating it. And the great thing now is, I think it's great, OPO is responsible for the rewrite of APD general orders. And we have a directive that it will now include community input. So literally every criticism that Fatima just made about the process, we now have an opportunity to correct. And particularly when it comes to community input on APD policy. And I'm telling you, the body cam one, that one is definitely one that we are very much looking forward to tackle.
I want to really quickly just add on to that, because I think that's really huge and a big win that was achieved this summer for sure on that. But as APD Chief Manley often says, culture eats policy for breakfast. And the culture of many of these departments is such that even the best written policies are ignored. And so that's one of the criticisms of purely policy-based reforms of police. We saw in New York, they had a policy not to use chokeholds since the mid-90s, right? But it still took 5 years to fire the officer who killed Eric Garner with a chokehold. Why? Because they just ignored the policy, right? So I think on an ongoing basis, after this rewrite, which I think is going to be really positive and very strong, we have to make sure, one, that APD can't just change the policy back anytime they want, which is something they've been doing. And then we actually have to make sure that folks are held accountable to that policy, right? And that is ultimately the big challenge. How do we create a culture where there's actually accountability to what's written down on that page?
What, and if I could just chime in one more time, because culture eats policy for breakfast. You're right. And the interesting thing is that you can have the policy. So first of all, I am so excited that the Austin PD will have this policy redrawn with community consultation. That does not happen enough around the country, and it needs to happen with a lot of the policies, not just the body camera policies all over the country. But another thing is that this conversation made me think about is that we see when you see officers doing things incorrectly and they are not facing any internal discipline, that tells you a lot about the culture. And not only does it create a culture that is what we used to say is it encourages and tolerates, a culture of violence within a police department. So you have to have these officers being held accountable internally and externally. We know that usually it's a small percentage of officers within a police department that are responsible for the majority of the complaints. And you can look back to the officer that killed George Floyd in the street with his knee on his neck, and he had 18 complaints. And so how does a person with that many complaints, sustained or unsustained, how do you continue to have that person interacting with your citizens and giving them, investing them the authority to do that? So we have to, and that means we also have to think about whistleblower protection and those officers in the police department who do want to do the right thing, not just standing around watching the murder happen, but being able to say, I need to step in here without a fear of losing my job or being retaliated against by my colleagues. So there's the accountability is a very long ladder, and there's a lot of steps on it.
Thank you. I like that. So yeah, I want to go further with this topic of cultural change within police departments. And one aspect that was mentioned was making sure that officers are held accountable. And another aspect that was mentioned was providing whistleblower protections for people who want to report abuses. Are there any other, and I know some of the other elements you probably were mentioned previously, but are there other elements towards enhancing and changing police culture in the police departments?
So as someone who is God's biggest joke and dated a police officer for 2.5 years, I learned a lot around the lack of accountability for Black police officers specifically, right? So you have Black people who want to be police officers are in policing, or Black and brown people. And the system, of course, was never made for Black bodies to be police officers. And in the city of Austin specifically, I don't know if you know, but there was a lot around race and the ability for the N-word to be used throughout the department, and Black police officers, the ones that spoke out about it, actually ended up having, investigations and things about them, right? So how do the people within the culture who want to change the culture get supported within policing, but also by community, is a conversation we don't talk about, because there are people in policing who are in policing to do exactly what we're saying. They're the ones that they call when somebody is sexually assaulted, or the ones that you want them to be there when something happens because they get your community, right? But then there's no support from within the system because they're a Black police officer, and there's no support within the community because they're a police officer. So then you have this disconnect between the person who decides that they want to go into policing because they love their community, and they realize that if they're in a uniform, there'll be less of us meeting them and being arrested. And then you have them going to work every day where they're being called the N-word and they're not being supported. So the culture is policing is a racist culture. It's a white man's culture. And until we start really talking about what the culture of policing is, then we can't try to change it. So even having a whistleblower policy, what does that mean if your internal affairs can step in and take over the investigation, even if you have a police office of oversight? What does that mean if you are a police officer who decided to blow a whistle and you get a call and nobody comes to support you on backup? Because that's a fear, right? It's a fear where if I say something about my coworker, then my other coworkers won't come if I'm in need of backup. And I'm not saying that this is something that we don't talk about this often. So if we're going to say that we need better police officers, and we need police officers who are going to get that man's knee off of that person's throat, then what's going to happen to that police officer who decided to tackle him to get him off that throat? Are their lives at jeopardy, literally, right, by their peers? We're not talking about a paycheck. We're talking about their actual life. And I think that when we start seeing a human-centered perspective around this work, and seeing that they're human beings that are putting on this uniform every day, how are we supporting the ones who are really doing this work from a place of knowing that if they're not there, then it will probably be even more numbers of us dying. There'll probably be more of us that are being incarcerated. We forget to talk about that. So I say all that to say, to answer your question, having whistleblower policies having these policies are one thing, but getting racist police officers out of office, out of the department, it has to happen. And being able to say that you can't decide that you want to have assistant police officers who are in the same class as as assistant chief of police that graduated in the same class as other racist police officers, and they've been on the force for 20 plus years and have been indicative of being jump out boys or people who used to bang up kids. We can't keep on saying that we're going to have the same old officers, just like politicians who have been in office. They've been in these departments doing the same thing and saying that we're going to get change. Some people need to retire. There needs to be more accountability from city government around policing too, and not just it being the department has its own entity, the city manager can't fire certain people. There needs to be more power in how people can get hired and fired and what that process looks like, so that culture can actually change, because police departments police themselves when it comes to the ability to hire and fire in certain ways. And you can't change, that's not how you change culture. So if we're really, really thinking about it, how are we able to create a way to fire police chiefs, right? Because if police chiefs aren't stepping down, they're not able to get fired directly from certain ways when things happen. So how do we create a system where the police aren't their own entity and able to do what they want to do and think that we're actually going to change culture? Because that's not a thing.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm gonna jump in and just say I'm really, really skeptical. We haven't even talked about the the biggest force in policing, which is what are called police unions, but are really police associations. And uniformly, these are highly conservative, reactionary, law and order, racist institutions that ultimately form they are the voice of policing. They are they contribute to political campaigns. They in many communities and at state houses control the debate around issues of policing. And until I start seeing the police elect leadership of themselves that is any way reflective of a desire to have to have dialogue with community and actually hold their own folks accountable and understand how that damages the profession, their communities, I will remain very skeptical that police culture can be changed. I mean, we see who the police unions across the country are endorsing. We see the thin blue line flags, many of them fly, and there's just, you know, it's hard to differentiate police, despite the folks I know that are in many departments that don't support that, right? That do want to support their community and have more of a dialogue. It feels a long way off.
Yeah, and I want to say, so the police unions, absolutely. If we don't deal with that beast, then we will never solve the problem of police accountability. We don't have unions in North Carolina, but we still have problems, police problems. So one other thing that I want to mention is, people talk about training. So I smile and I almost laugh at that, because training is not going to change police culture. Training is good, and we should do it. We ought to do it. We're obligated to do it, whether it is training in terms of when you can actually use deadly force, training of implicit bias, which, again, that term I have a problem with usually is explicit bias, and we're trying to make ourselves feel better by telling people, oh, it's implicit, you didn't mean to do it. But this concept of training, I would rather on the front end hire the right people to do the right job than have to train out racism, bigotry, and a propensity for violence. So we didn't say it here, but it's on the table, and you hear so many people talk about it. But we have got to get beyond this over-reliance on training and thinking that is going to solve this problem. There are a lot of things that we can do. You can have an early warning tracking system, and you can deal with those problem officers when you see a problem happening, and they can be fired. But if you're in a place that has a union, that can be problematic. But we also need to know that when something happens with a police officer, so I see in the chat or in the Q&A, someone talking about a national system to track police behavior. And we need to do that. And we know that there's licensing revocation that needs to happen, so that if you kill somebody or brutalize someone in North Carolina, that you can't go down to Texas and be hired to do the same thing again. So there are some things that we can, some what I call quick fixes, some things that we can do. But it's going to be incredibly difficult, as Chris said, in these places where you have very active police unions.
Thank you. So next, I'm going to direct this to Fatima, but everyone, please chime in. Please discuss the premise behind transformative justice and how it could apply to community and police relationships. And also, can you talk a little bit about trauma-informed care and what that means in this context?
Sure. So, transformative justice is it barked upon restorative justice, and then it was birthed from restorative justice, and then became broader. So, what I know to be transformative justice and how I utilize it, it's a human-centered approach. And it's a human-centered approach on every aspect. So you're thinking of all the humans involved in terms of policy reform and cultural reform. You're thinking about, so if I always think there's three parties, right? The person who's administering it, the person, the employees, and then you have the people who are impacted. So from each stage, we're thinking about, if I decide to write a policy on or training, then how is the administration going to be impacted by this from their human, right? How is the employees going to be impacted? They're human. And then how are the people who are then going to come in contact with these individuals, how are they going to be impacted? And then once we start considering that, then we're looking at how do we transform what used to be into what we would like to be, getting the voices of everyone to be included. So it's not just top down or bottom up. It's a circular movement. It's a holistic approach to honoring that we're all human beings having our own human being experience, and taking that knowledge and information and utilizing it to structure something. So for example, people like to call it trauma-informed care. I like to use healing-centered. It is known that if you live in the United States, you have been traumatized in some way. Everyone is walking around with their own traumas. To be trauma-informed or healing-centered is to move from a space of knowing that when you engage with another person, that person has their own traumas and therefore triggers. And if you are informed that this other person, you don't need to know what their triggers are, you don't need to know what their traumas are, but if you are informed and privy to the fact that they are traumatized, then you can move through and with a certain way. So most healing-centered approaches deal with consent. Consent is not something that we utilize in our everyday. I mean, even being in a pandemic, people don't utilize consent to touch you, which they should now more than ever. But consent is such a major part of being in a trauma-informed space, because most traumas are caused because one wasn't able to consent to the encounter. So I am not able to consent to this encounter, therefore I'm triggered and traumatized. And because I'm triggered and traumatized, any other encounter that I have that is similar to that, then I may respond from a state of fight or flight or freeze. So police officers, we don't look at police officers as being traumatized human beings, but they are. Police officers have to go to some of the most horrible things ever that I know I never want to go to. I never want to have to see some of the things that they see every single day. And they don't go, there's nothing within their policies and their procedures that have them do like calm down. So like, for example, if they went to a suicide call, or they just saw a kid that was killed, they have to do a report and they get right back on the street. And so if I just saw a kid get shot, or I just, had to, put a kid in an ambulance because they were dead, and then now I'm on a traffic stop 45 minutes later, my encounter with that person may not be the best encounter, because I'm still dealing with my human as being traumatized. A lot of police departments don't include trauma-informed therapy even within their benefits. So if someone is shot and killed, or a police officer is in a police-involved shooting, they don't get access to specialists that know how to deal with it. And so when we live in an environment that is speaking of human beings and not honoring the human experience, it's not transformative. We can't expect to have a transformative system or experience without honoring the human beings that are being in contact and or being included in different processes. So yeah, I guess that would be the definition and ways. But in terms of the policing specifically, I personally believe if our police officers had trauma-informed care and access to trauma-informed information to deal with themselves, not other people, themselves first, the outcomes would be a lot different, because a lot of police officers are moving from a state of fight, flight, or freeze because they're humans, and humans do that anyway.
All right, I like that. That was beautifully said. And so I know everyone here is concerned about some notion of justice. And so that was transformative justice. But can each of you talk about what justice would look like to you in this space? Or if you use another term, that's fine too. But what does justice look like ultimately for you? Chris, I see you. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, well, that's a new question, and it's a tough one, but yeah. So I think I agree with what Fatima said, but also when I think about transformative justice, I think even beyond what many people is starting to grow a lot, which is like restorative justice. This idea that all the members or all the people involved in an event that caused harm are engaged in and take part in a process whereby they decide how to address that harm and restore the folks that were victimized. Transformative justice takes it another step further and says, how do we transform the situation under which this harm occurred in the first place? If I have two poor people and one steals from another, I don't want to restore them back to their states of poverty. I want to actually address the poverty in that community. When we look at what's really informing and behind so much of the efforts now to reduce police resources, it's based on a similar notion, right? When we look in Travis County, 3/4 of the folks that are brought on charges in our county are at or below the federal poverty line, all right? They qualify for indigent defense. This is who the police are policing. This is who our system is deciding to move forward with charges. It stands to reason then that if we were to eliminate that poverty in our community, we would therefore eliminate so much of the need for the courts, for the prosecution, for the police themselves. And so how can we take the resources we're now putting into those systems and put them into our communities to alleviate and eliminate that poverty? And this, to me, is justice, is actually having communities and societies where we can all live in dignity and decency and have what, at minimum, what we need to get by on the day-to-day, as well as opportunities to use the gifts that we have or that we develop in service of some personal gain, but also for the gain for the whole. And obviously, to the extent possible, where harm occurs, it can be addressed in a restorative fashion whenever possible. And people aren't necessarily subjected to, again, whenever possible, incarceration, violence, and these other harms. So that's a quick answer, I guess.
I think I would say very simplistically, I'm really looking for more humanization and a mutual understanding. And I come from the perspective of putting a higher expectation on law enforcement because they work for us. We don't work for them. And but the hierarchy is the reverse, right? Because they can take our life and our liberty. And so for me, it really concerns me that we have members of our community that have such strong emotional responses to being pulled over, right? And that is real for Black people, right? And it is real for Black people to have conversations with their children about how to interact with police. And we know that many other cultures and ethnicities it never occurs to them to have that conversation, right? And so I just think about the emotional impact that has on Black people every day, right? And then for what I do in terms of oversight, I always think of the officer perspective. And that's why I always find it shocking that people were shocked that I would be interested in officer mental health, because or physical well-being, or however you want to phrase it, because in my mind, that has a direct correlation to how they interact with the public, right? And so what I look at, the lens I look at, is the interaction between the public and law enforcement, and pretty much how do we improve that? But my perspective is the responsibility is on law enforcement, it's not on the community. Because when you look at the historical context that Cami has given us in the beginning of this talk, you cannot put that responsibility on the community given how law enforcement began, right? And so I am really, I think it's a little bit too simplistic, maybe a little idealistic, but I am really fundamentally trying to get law enforcement to see all of us as human beings and all of us not as the enemy. And this ties to the conversation, the points that Cami was making about training. I mean, I agree that training is important, right? But what we forget is the training on the job that changes the perspective. And we're never really going to be able to address that until we have real strong and honest conversations about law enforcement and what it means in our communities and how it's impacted our communities. And so I believe in everything that Fatima said, but I think that we have to really go deeper and fundamentally look at each other as human beings and really understand that perspective. And I think that can be a component of justice.
So it's interesting because I love what everybody else said, and it's so much better than what I'm about to say, but I'm a law professor, so I gotta bring it back to the law. And I'm thinking about our substantive criminal law is out of hand. I mean, when you can approach a person and choke them because of selling loose cigarettes, where are our values? What is I think back to, your underlying theories of punishment and retribution and utilitarianism, right? We're thinking about first year criminal law. It's disproportionate, it's inefficient, it's expensive, it's for so many reasons doesn't make sense. So our substantive criminal law is completely out of hand. We need to limit. And so again, when we're thinking about the defunding argument, to me, we need less violent interactions with police officers and people of color and Black people in particular. And so how do we do that? Well, let's give police officers less authority to interact with them in the first place. And that starts a lot of that with your substantive criminal law. You cannot, you should not be able to have, as I said, an armed first responder in certain situations. And that saves lives on both ways a lot of times. So I just think that we need to really think about why we have invested police officers with so much authority to have these interactions with Black people in the first place. And what justice looks like to me is I want you to do in my community what you would do in yours. Would you knock down the door, a no-knock warrant, and open fire? And I can name a neighborhood. I don't know any Austin neighborhoods, but here in Winston, you wouldn't do it probably in the neighborhood where I live. You might not do that. That's not going to happen to people, but it's going to happen on another side of town without a thought, because people don't believe in the inherent value of the people that live there. And so it goes back to what Farah was saying. We've got to have that human element, and we've got to constrict our substantive criminal law so that people don't have the authority to do some of the things that they're doing today.
The justice, the word itself to me just holds so much trauma, because we've been seeking it for how long, and how many people have died to have it, and what is it really, right? Like, what is justice to me, like at this point? So to me, I don't want justice. I want human connection. I want to be seen as a human being. I want humanity to be the thing. I don't want hierarchy. I want us to strip this idea of having and needing labels, so these labels hold some sort of weight, and this weight means that per definition, I'm going to be treated a certain way, and I should treat you a certain way. This hierarchy that white supremacist society has created is the reason why we have the laws that we have. It's the reason why human beings can't be seen as human beings, is because most of us move from what I like to call a colonized consciousness. We've all been colonized to believe that there's a greater than and less than per whatever label you've been given. And to me, the human connection causes safety. If I'm connected to another human being, I'm going to feel more safe with you than anything. And to me, that's what I'm seeking. I'm seeking a world of human connection. And no matter what your job is, no matter what your label is, we can all agree that all humans come from a womb. All humans have to be in a womb for at least a certain amount of time to become said human. And I think that is the problem, is that we've been conditioned to be systemic and not human-centered. And so most of the time we're thinking of a system or a framework or some numbers and not realizing that these are people's lives. This is someone's child. It's someone that someone loves. It's someone that is sharing the same earth and the same air at the same time. And we don't, that's not how we look to engage with people, just in general, just in the activist world, in the political world. It's like, it's always like, what can I do for you and what can you do for me? Not, have you been drinking water? Are you taking care of yourself? How do you feel today? All these things play a role in what we do, and how we move is important. So to me, I don't even think I believe in justice anymore. I believe in human connection. I believe that if we connect more as human beings, and we can start seeing each other as human beings, then maybe things will shift. And that's like, I'm like, fair, it's idealist, right? It's idealist to believe that at some point we can all pause and really see each other. And I can see myself in a white man, and a white man can see themselves in me, or a police officer can see themselves in me, if they see me as a human, not as a perp or as this thing that society has conditioned us to believe because of skin color or a hierarchy. So if we get rid of hierarchy, if we get rid of a lot of these labels that hold so much trauma and hold so much violence and hold so much weight, I think that things could alter. And then I think also honesty, being real, calling things what they are, racist being racist. We keep on putting our faith in certain politicians who have shown us that, it's not like, you've been in office since before I was thought of, and we still have the same problem. So why are you still there? So thinking about this idea of like hierarchy and one person being better than the other because of what label, whatever that label is, gender, race, socioeconomic status, all of those things play a role in how we think about each other and ourselves, which cause us to not engage when we decide to check in. So I don't believe in justice, just in connection.
Well, you make a great point here, and we're sort of wrapping up, but you made this point about being tired, and it's been a long road and a long trek. And so my question for everyone as we wrap up sort of briefly here is, what keeps you going, right? We all have some end goal. We might call it something different, but what keeps you going? Because I know I've seen your faces, so I know you've all been on these sorts of calls and things like that for some time. And what keeps you going, basically? What's the point of hope?
I can tell you what keeps me going is, I'm a Black woman who really cares about my community, and I have 2 nephews, and I don't want my nephews to experience what Black men experience in this country. And I think that we can do better. And I think we can be better. And so I just think that as a community, particularly the Black community, we have seen and been through enough. And I remember posting on my Facebook page a picture of a march in Austin. I believe it was in 1963. And then side by side, I posted the march that occurred on June 7th, 2020. And I was like, okay, let me do some quick math, 57 years later, right? And we're fundamentally marching on the same thing. And so, and I wrote, will we be having the same march in 57 years from now? And I'm hoping we won't be. And so for me personally, I have to feel that I can make a change in some way. And I really feel that I can. And it's important that when I think about the declining Black population in Austin, that motivates me too, because Austin has opportunities here that I feel that Black people should take advantage of and should be able to have opportunities, and it's not happening. And so, so what motivates me is what can be better. I believe we can be better. I believe we can do better. And I think about people who are coming behind me, and I want to leave something positive for them.
It's interesting because Farah mentioned like she was looking at this picture, from the 60s, and then looking at it, looking at current events. And, I'm going to date myself, but I watched as a high schooler Rodney King being dragged out of his car and beaten by members of the Los Angeles Police Department and people from all these other agencies that stood there and watched it happen and no one intervened. And then a year later, I watched as the officers in that case were acquitted by the state court, and then the Los Angeles Rebellion happened. So, and those events to me were just like yesterday. And I know that witnessing that, again, from an entirely different coast on TV, but witnessing that and the brutality and the lack of justice in that state prosecution, it was what prompted me to go to law school and to try to be an advocate. And so I hope that everything that we're seeing, unfortunately still seeing all these years later, will encourage others to do the same and continue in the struggle. And I can say that even the space and time that's passed, the coalitions, the people who are protesting, they look different, and the coalitions that are being built are larger and stronger, and change is happening still slowly, but a little bit more quickly than it did then. So that's what gives me hope.
I'll be quick. You know, what keeps me going is that when I see when I see injustice, when I see suffering, it really, really bothers me. And if I'm not doing something, then I'm not happy about it, and I'm not happy with myself. So I'm very much. And then the other thing is, you know, we, while it's very weak and it has been for a long time, especially for many folks of color, we still live in a democracy, and that means that each and every one of us is responsible for the actions perpetrated by the government and people that are government agents. And so I personally feel a level of responsibility to stop when I see someone who works for the government harming people, or government institutions continually harming people for years and years and years with no end. So I think, you know, for me, I want the government that represents me, to the extent that it does, to treat people fairly and justly, and provide, especially a place as rich as we are, people with what they need on a day-to-day basis.
Love keeps me going. Love for self, love for the 7 generations that come after me. Love in knowing that I would want someone to do it for me if it was me on the other side. So I like to say that I'm selfish, and I do what I do because if it was me, I would want somebody to be out here in these streets. I'd want somebody at the table. I'd want somebody to say my name. I'd want somebody to love me enough, to think of me enough to do this work. And so love keeps me doing it. Love keeps me wanting to do it, and love will continuously allow me to do this work. And it's different because we don't live in a world that talks about love enough, but this is love work. If we're going to change the world and have a world that we seek for the future 7 generations, we have to be doing it in love too.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'll let Ricky sort of close us. We're closing just on time, so we'll give him a second to pop on here.
Thank you, everybody. That was an amazing conversation, and I'm glad to have everybody come together so that we can have that necessary conversation. Just for the attendees, I just want to thank you again for attending, and special thanks to all of the panelists as well. Please feel free to look up any information related to IUPRA right here on this slide. As you can see, our information on Twitter is there, our Facebook information is there, and you could always reach our IUPRA multimedia communication specialist at the email provided right there in the blue, holly.collins@austin.utexas.edu. So again, thank you for everybody for coming through, and y'all have a great weekend. Be safe out there.